Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm continuing the analysis into Nietzsche's Will to Power. I'm not sure exactly where we are as far as video count, but I would imagine if we haven't reached 100, we're close to 100 already, so we're making substantial progress. I'm going to try and go through Chapter 2 relatively quickly. I have some other things that I'm attempting to complete, but as I said in, I don't know, a few hours back probably, what I'm doing is I'm breaking the chapter into 100 section notes. So I'll do notes for 100 sections, then I'll shoot the video on those notes for 100 sections. I'll proceed to do notes on 100 sections, then I'll shoot video for those notes. If you want to keep up to date, remember that the PDF is downloadable. Basically just click the banner ad or the link that'll pop up. It'll take you to the PDF, download the PDF. It'll expand as the lectures continue. Don't really have much more to say. With that, let's begin Nietzsche's Will to Power, section 8.2 in the notes, and this is going to cover notes 145 to 170. Okay, so this is Will to Power. And this is 8.2 in the notes, and it's notes 145 through 170. Okay, just a quick note at the top of page 130. I've put this note earlier in other sections. I'm going to basically be skipping over things that I've already covered, either within the beginning of chapter or book 2, or we've already covered in book 1. I don't want to rehash the Nietzschean account, the collapse of the highest values, the anti-biological, all of that has already been stated, so there really doesn't make much sense for me to keep rehashing that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try and expand on new concepts that Nietzsche introduces, and hopefully by the end of the lecture series, and hopefully we'll get to the end of the lecture series, put and synthesize all of that information together, and then allow you to synthesize the information together as well. This particular section heading begins with, I've titled it Action and Religion. Action and Religion. Okay. The first thing to recognize about this idea of action and religion. Remember, before, sort of just give you to sort of set the scene before we just jump right in, right? I don't want to, I don't want to just, hey, we just began, let's go heavy. So just to sort of set the scene, when we talk about actions, you can think of it in the following manner, right? Imagine that we have an individual, and we have, let's just say, for example, an object in the external world, right? And this individual is going to basically pick up this object from the external world and move it to a new position. Pretty simple. All right, I want to keep this very simple. Okay, so individual, perceiver if you want to call them, sees an object in the external world, picks up that object and relocates that object to a new position. Pretty simple, right? We can say that the act, right, the action that occurred, in sort of general terms, was the relocation of object 1, assuming that it's one and the same object, right? Object 1 from position 1 to position 2, right? So the act occurred in the world, and this is like the general account, and we moved an object, for example, a book from a desk to a shelf. Pretty simple. Now, when we're talking about the action, if the action under consideration is an action such as this, sort of the act of moving an object from one place to another, the act is really a non-moral action, right? The action in and of itself does not elicit moral consideration, right? Well, this particular action doesn't, under this particular circumstance, doesn't elicit moral consideration, right? It's a non-moral act. Right, so I move an action. I move an object from space 1 to space 2. There's no moral consequences. Nobody gets hurt. I'm not hurt. It's just sort of the relocation of an object in space. Okay. All of our actions, however, aren't non-moral actions, right? some of our actions are actually moral. We would like to think that these actions are moral. And later on, I'm not going to jump ahead way too much, but we'll address some of the common misconceptions on Nietzsche. One of the common misconceptions, without getting into the semantics of it all, is that Nietzsche doesn't believe in morality. That's not accurate, right? And I'm not going to explain what it is that he espouses because we're not there yet. Now, imagine, however, whatever this event was, object one being relocated in space. Imagine, for whatever reason, that did have moral consequences, right? That there were moral consequences for this object. So, for example, this is something that I've prided myself in. I love it more than any of my possessions, and I tell one of my children, whatever you do, don't mess with it, don't move it. You know, this is daddy's favorite thing. My child comes in and moves it. There are, in a sense, moral repercussions, right? There are acts of judgment that are going to be placed on the act. This should be very simple, right? So, if we're talking about an action in a non-moral sense, it's pretty pedestrian. If we're talking about an action in a moral sense, it's basically the same structure. I'm not going to draw anything different. But the only thing that I'm going to draw, and I'm going to actually use a different color, the only thing I'm going to draw different is that the action is contained within the scope of morality. Right? And what ends up happening is that the act itself becomes conditioned and contingent on, so I'll write this down, the act becomes, and actually let me be very technical, for moral acts and actions morality, and actions judgment. For moral acts and actions judgment is contingent, right? And the question is, well, what is it contingent on? If I'm going to judge the act, whatever the act is, as being either moral or immoral, so we know that when we're talking about judgment now, we're talking about the action is either moral or it's immoral, right? If I am attempting to make considerations of an act, and that action is going to be judged by the moral law, the moral imperative, then we recognize that for moral acts, an action's judgment is going to be contingent on the moral agent's conformity to the law, right? If I conform to the moral law, then my actions will be deemed appropriate, right? It's contingent on the moral right? So for moral acts, an action's judgment is contingent on the moral agent's conformity to the law, right? Simple example. What we saw in a previous example, and I discussed this many times before in the past, is Nietzsche wants to determine whether or not it is a legitimate, and this is what's important, right? And I really want, I'm trying to break this down to the most level, because what we're going to discuss is going to get extremely complicated in a bit. What Nietzsche wants you to recognize, wants us to recognize, is not so much the fact that morality is used to assess or to judge actions per se, but the question then becomes, what is the legitimacy of the moral imperative, right? On what grounds are we legitimizing this moral imperative, right? So it's not just this sort of knee-jerk reaction that, oh, Nietzsche is against morality, and he believes that moralities posit high values which we can't attain, and therefore we should do away with morality. That's actually a straw man. It's a pretty grotesque straw man of what Nietzsche's doing. It's not even so much to claim just that morality is used as a means of assessing and judging, casting judgment on action, or even punishment if you want to go further on action. It's not even just that. The question becomes, on what merit? What is the merit that legitimizes our morality?